I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Could you please commence by providing your name?
My name is Emma Victoria Reid.
Ms. Reid, whilst you give evidence, could I remind you to keep your voice up? I don't think there'll be a problem. And also to make sure you speak clearly into the microphone so that your evidence may be properly recorded. Have you kindly agreed to provide a statement to this inquiry?
Yes, I have.
May we have, please, 195847 up, please. Does that appear to be your statement?
It does.
And if we have the last page, you provided a signature and a statement of truth.
I did.
Milady, may that be published, please?
Certainly.
Miss Reid, you've been a civil servant, I think, since April of 2003, and you've held a number of posts, not just in the Department of Health and Social Care, but also the Cabinet Office and the Government Equalities Office. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And were you appointed to the Senior Civil Service in April of 2013?
Yes, I was.
From November 2014 until June 2015, were you one of the two deputy directors in the Department of Health and Social Care, leading on the response to the Ebola outbreak?
Yes, I was.
And most significantly, are you currently director of the directorate in the Department of Health and Social Care, which is the Directorate of Emergency Preparedness and Health Protection?
Yes, I am.
And have you been in that post since February of 2018?
Yes.
Could you assist us, please, in broad terms, with the nature of the functions discharged within that directorate? We've heard a considerable amount of evidence about the various functions in the Department of Health and Social Care, and I therefore want to ask you what that particular directorate is concerned with. Is it, by way of commencement, the directorate that discharges or plays its part in discharging the duty on the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care by virtue of being a Category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004?
Yes, but allow me to set out broadly where my responsibilities in the directorate fall, and they broadly fall into two different areas. I have responsibility for health protection and health security policy.
Can I come back to that, Ms. Reid?
Of course.
There is a method to my madness. I wanted you to set out generically the functions of the directorate before we look at health protection and health security. So one of the major functions of the directorate is to discharge the duty on the Secretary of State by virtue of being a Category 1 responder under the CCA. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
Is another responsibility to discharge whatever functions are imposed on the DHSC by virtue of being the lead government department when it comes to health emergencies?
Yes, it is.
Is it also part of your directorate's functions to be concerned in that risk assessment process?
Yes, it is.
Of which we've heard. And is it also your directorate which liaises with bodies such as the United Kingdom Health Security Agency and NHS England and the Department of Levelling Up and Housing and Communities when it comes to assessing risk, managing risk, preparing for health emergencies?
Yes, it is.
And importantly, given the extent of the burdens on you, is that why your directorate, the Emergency Preparedness and Health Protection Directorate, has led the DHSE's response to all the major incidents to which you speak in your statement? Monkeypox, the Novichok poisoning, the heat wave of 2022, and so on and so forth.
Yes, it is.
All right. So you've referred to health protection and also to health security. What are they, and what is the difference between them?
So health protection and health security policies form part of half of my responsibility. The types of policy that we have responsibility for in that area includes pandemic preparedness, emerging infectious disease, antimicrobial resistance. They are essentially about how the public health is protected, but also what threats under infectious diseases, emerging diseases and pandemics may well be a risk to public health.
So that's all under health protection?
And health security.
Are they together?
Yes, they are.
All right. Your statement refers to the Directorate having 3 branches, and you distinguish between health protection and health security, but are they in fact the same area?
They are very closely related to each other and sit very closely adjoined.
So which branch does the topic of pandemic preparedness fall under?
Predominantly under health protection.
Right. Is there in your directorate a third branch called the Operational Response Centre?
Yes.
What does that do?
So that covers the responsibilities you set out at the beginning of the questions, which relate to the discharge of the Category 1 responder capability, and is about how we prepare for threats and hazards that impact on public health and how we respond also to those threats.
So is it an emergency management centre? Does it deal with crisis management?
It does. It delivers emergency preparedness, resilience and response.
And is the history, the etymology of the Operational Response Centre, that it was first created within health and social care to deal with the necessary preparations for the no-deal EU exit, but latterly it is now the Crisis Management Centre in the Department of Health and Social Care that deals with all emergency preparedness, response and resilience issues?
That's not quite right. The department has had a long-standing function that deals with emergency preparedness, resilience and response, and that was always part of the responsibility of this directorate and was part of my responsibility when I took the post in 2018. In preparation for a no-deal exit, we also developed an operational response centre that was focused on those particular capabilities for that threat. And following the exit from the European Union, we merged both of those functions together to form what was then called the Operational Response Centre. That brings in EPRR responsibility as well.
I'm going to have to task you about your use of the word function. It's a word that
I apologise.
No, don't. There's no apology required. What do you mean when you say it had different functions? Do you mean there were different rooms, different operational response centres, different groups of people, or it was the same group of people just doing 2 different jobs? I'm going to have to task you about your use of the word function. It's a word that
I apologise.
No, don't. There's no apology required. What do you mean when you say it had different functions? Do you mean there were different rooms, different operational response centres, different groups of people, or it was the same group of people just doing 2 different jobs?
It was, so functions, by functions I mean a set of capabilities of ways of working that we use to manage an emergency. In emergency response, we had ones that dealt with broader threats, and in the operational response centre, these were particular sets of products and ways of working that were specifically focused on no-deal exit.
All right, so different jobs, but they were the same people. They were just dealing with at different times no-deal exit preparations or general EPRR responses?
No, they were different people. We maintained a capability to make sure that we were ready for any type of emergency, separate from the work we did to prepare for a no-deal exit.
Right.
They were in the same part of my directorate, but they were different sets of people.
Right, that's clear, thank you. Milady's heard evidence about the high-level risk register that was held in the Department of Health and Social Care, and a departmental board meeting which held what was called a risk deep dive into major infection diseases within the department, how the department would respond. Could we please have 22738 on the screen? This is a document, Ms. Reid, dated the 28th September 16, so it's before your time, because, as you've told us, you've been in post since February 2018. If we look at page 2, please, would you just read the middle bullet point within the red box?
Thank you.
At the time that you took up your position as director of the relevant directorate, to what extent did you understand that steps had been taken to address that plainly very serious and real concern? Were you told what had been done to raise awareness of the risk and to plan off in the directorate?
I was not made aware of that particular commitment or issue raised in 2016.
Were you not told by anybody, Ms. Reid, congratulations, you're the director of the directorate, you need to be aware that the main departmental board for the entire department, the DHSC, stated 2 years before there was a very real concern that the entire directorate would be rapidly overwhelmed in the event of a major pandemic. And this is what we're doing about it.
At the point that I took over the post, we did think about the resourcing models and methods for escalating and scaling up our resource if it was needed, but that was never aligned to this discussion in 2016. It was part of our regular resourcing considerations.
Could we have the minutes of that departmental board meeting at 5727? Time. But there are, on page 6, I'm just going to refer you to them and then give you time to read them. Paragraphs 25, the not that even a moderate pandemic would overrun the system. So not the department, in fact, but the system, the government. Or quarantine thousands of people. And then at 26, concerns are expressed about how resilient the sum system for preparedness. So would you just like to just reflect on those two paragraphs?
Thank you.
Do you recall when you took up post, anybody briefing you about Department of Health and Social Care's own departmental board about whether or not there were, in the event of even a moderate pandemic? What about track and trace? Anything about that?
There was no discussion with me about track and trace.
All right. And then in relation to paragraph 26, Ms. Reid, we've got concerns about how fragmented the system for preparedness in the United Kingdom has become. Grapple with.
In the process for how the system will respond to a pandemic, and by the system I mean organisations in health and social care, was both a factor of our pandemic flu readiness programme, but also one of the learnings from Operation Cygnus. So the intent of that paragraph and the issue relating to system overload was something that I was aware of, yes.
In essence, these concerns were being addressed because there were boards and systems and procedures otherwise in place to try to make sure the system was better prepared.
Yes.
Right. Well, we'll look then at those boards in a moment. An important part of your directorate's preparedness arrangements was its, and I'm now going to slip into the terminology, its ownership of a 2011 pandemic influenza strategy.
Yes.
Was it not?
Yes.
Because that was a strategy dealing with influenza pandemic, a health emergency, and therefore by definition something within the reach of the Department of Health and Social Care.
Yes.
Or the Department of Health, as it was then known. Can you recall what you understood when you took up your post about the efficacy, the appropriateness, the adequacy of that strategy, whether it was a good strategy, whether confidence was placed in it, whether it needed refreshing, whether it needed updating or wholesale revision? Can you recall what the state of play was?
As I recall, the view was that the strategy included important component parts that would be used for a pandemic influenza, that it had been tested through exercise Cygnus, and there were elements of that needed to be enhanced, and that there was a work programme underway through the Pandemic Flu Readiness Board to deliver that.
Were you concerned by the fact that exercise Cygnus itself had concluded that the UK's plans, policies and capability for preparedness were not sufficient to cope with the extreme demands of a severe pandemic? So you've referred to Cygnus, and your answer essentially is, well, I understand that Cygnus, which had taken place before your time again, had addressed elements of the strategy. But the exercise Cygnus conclusion was rather more serious than that, wasn't it?
It was very clear that there was a lot of work that the department needed to do to improve its readiness for pandemic influenza. If the question you're asking was I concerned about that? Yes, I was concerned about that, but I was also aware that by the time I'd started in my post in 2018, a programme of work had been established to address those concerns.
And it was therefore of central concern to you that those programmes should continue because they were put into place for a good reason, namely to meet the serious concerns of this, of the departmental board's observations, the outcome of exercise Cygnus, and a clear understanding that the 2011 strategy needed at the least some work doing on it.
Yes.
All right. That 2011 strategy was the only pandemic scale strategy, wasn't it?
It's the only one that was centrally run by the Department of Health, yes.
Well, pandemic is a health emergency. It goes to the heart of your department's functions. Who else would have an overarching health emergency related strategy for pandemic influenza?
I would expect that key organisations responsible for delivering pandemic influenza response would also have thought through and have plans in place for how they would respond. So that would include NHS England, Public Health England and local delivery partners.
In the event of a national crisis, in the event of a, as it turns out, a catastrophic health emergency, the Department of Health and Social Care is the lead government department which drives forward what is required to be done to prepare for and initially, at any rate, respond to that crisis.
That's correct.
So what other strategies for dealing with a pandemic scale catastrophe were there than this single document?
The Department of Health owned the single document for the strategy for pandemic influenza preparedness.
Right. And it was the only strategy document, was it not?
Yes.
There was no strategy document for anything other than an influenza pandemic.
That's correct.
Could we have 22708, page 14? Three bullet points from the bottom in paragraph 2.21, there's a reference to the intrinsic unpredictability of influenza pandemics. Ms. Reid, could you just have a read of that bullet point, please?
Thank you.
You are not by training an epidemiologist.
No.
Why did no one in the directorate, with an eye to that bullet point, ask himself or herself, we have a strategy for dealing with influenza pandemic, but because influenza pandemics are intrinsically unpredictable, and because we may be struck by a pandemic that is not influenza, but is another viral respiratory outbreak that is equally unpredictable as influenza, and therefore equally catastrophic. We need to have plans for that eventuality. Why was that question not asked?
The preparedness we developed for pandemic influenza was based on the reasonable worst case scenario. So effectively, every renewal of that risk assessment did ask whether what the scenario would be that we ought to prepare for. And on successive risk assessments, the risk assessment was the pandemic we should prepare for was a pandemic influenza.
But those very same risk assessment processes referred, of course, to the possibility or the risk of a non-influenza pandemic. And those same processes stated in terms that there were inherent variabilities, that the pandemic, the next pandemic, might or might not be influenza. It might have the same characteristics. It could be just as deadly or more so. It could have higher transmission or less transmission. It could be just as severe or less severe. Where were the plans for dealing with those eventualities?
Well, the plans that we developed and the mitigations we built were based on the risk that we had been informed was the most likely risk that experts advised me and colleagues that was the highest risk, and that was of an influenza pandemic. Alongside the influenza pandemic is a risk that relates to emerging infectious disease. And in that risk scenario, we had prepared mitigations and responses that would respond to that risk should that risk materialise.
But you know very well, of course, that that risk, the emerging infectious disease risk, was predicated upon and assumed confinement to health setting outbreak. That is to say, it wouldn't extend probably beyond health settings, and that there would be a very small, relatively speaking, number of casualties and an even smaller number of fatalities.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Could we look at page 57 in this document, please? The 2011 strategy assumed, and we can see it, paragraph 7.5, that staff absence is likely to be significantly higher than normal across all settings, all sectors. Levels of absence may vary due to the size. And then if you could scroll back out, please, and in the middle of the page, 7.4. The government will encourage those who are well to carry on with their normal daily lives. The UK government does not plan to close borders, stop mass gatherings, or impose controls on public transport during any pandemic. Any pandemic. Between 2011, when this strategy was first made, Ms. Reid, and 2020, when the non-influenza pandemic struck, are you aware in the Department of Health and Social Care of any person at any time questioning that statement? The UK government does not plan to close borders, stop mass gatherings, or impose controls. Was there any debate about the possible necessity of border closings, self-isolation, quarantine, mass quarantine, mandatory quarantine, or anything?
Those areas of mitigation, no.
Could we have 23131, please? This is a pandemic preparedness meeting, Miss Reid, but about a year and a half after you had taken up your post. It's a meeting, a PIP meeting or a PFRB meeting. We'll come back to those in a moment. It's just a departmental meeting. Page 5. I'll read out the relevant bit and then give you a moment to find the part on the screen. On the right hand side, there is a heading, Areas of Work Not Prioritised. The briefing paper, which outlined plans to augment adult social and community care during a pandemic, was agreed by the Dame Sally Davis, the CSA and the CNO in July 18, DHSC Policy and Social Care Team to work with National Health Service England and Improvement, Public Health Communication Strategy. The content was signed off, but it needs further work. A concept of operation for use in an influenza pandemic. And then refresh of UK pandemic influenza strategy. Update the content of the strategy to ensure that the UK pandemic influenza preparedness and response policy is accurate and up to date.
Thank you.
These areas of work, which were not prioritised, were of fundamental importance, were they not, to the United Kingdom and the Department of Health and Social Care's ability to be properly prepared for a pandemic?
They were important pieces of work in the pandemic flu readiness programme, yes. They were not the areas of priority.
Are you suggesting, Ms. Reid, that the bringing up to date and making accurate of the United Kingdom's sole strategy for influenza preparedness was not a matter of very considerable importance?
No, sorry, allow me to clarify. These pieces of work were important as part of the pan-flu readiness programme, and they were important pieces within that programme. However, as I am happy to expand, at that period of time in readiness for the potential disruption of a no-deal exit, my view at that time was preparing for a no-deal exit took precedent over completion of some of these pieces of work for a short period of time.
Did you or anybody else, when confronted with, and it was a cabinet direction, wasn't it?
Yes.
Work must be, to use the etymology, the terminology, work must be prioritised. The euphemism for the cessation or interruption or complete stopping of other work streams in order to be able to focus on preparations for a no-deal EU exit. That came from the highest level, did it not?
It did, yes.
It did. Did anybody in the Department of Health and Social Care, which bore the primary responsibility for getting the country ready for a health emergency, say, these important, you use the word vital, these vital parts of pandemic preparedness cannot afford to be stopped?
To look at which areas of work we would prioritise or deprioritise in order to prepare for a no-deal exit. And in thinking through which areas of work I would deprioritise and prioritise, I recall a submission going to ministers to set out which areas of work I would recommend that we prioritised and deprioritised. On the case of adult social care particularly, I think it may be helpful to add that my concern about the impact of adult social care as a result of a no-deal exit, a real and credible threat to that sector, was that that sector needed to prepare for and ready itself for a no-deal exit over the risk of a pandemic preparedness.
The concern that flowed from not being ready for a no-deal care sector,
yes,
was that there would be an interruption of staff to work in the sector, problems with employment and work in the United Kingdom after a abrupt and traumatic no.
At that time we weren't certain what additional financial pressure would be on the sector as a result of a no-deal exit, so that was an additional concern.
Was it ever seriously considered by anybody in your department that one of the consequences of an unprepared no-deal EU exit would be death? The deaths of very large numbers of inhabitants of care homes?
I think that the human aspect and risks associated with that relating to a no-deal exit were considered. I don't have the details of what the risk assessment said of a no-deal exit, but the risk of harm to the public was absolutely a consideration.
In the risk assessment process, and the procedure was updated, as you know, in 2016 and then 2019, what was the assumed outcome of a severe influenza pandemic on the United Kingdom in terms of fatalities?
If I recall, I believe the number to be about 800,000, I think, but I'm recalling I might have that number incorrect.
Around 800,000 deaths, of which, if the pandemic were to be particularly dangerous to the elderly, a significant proportion of those deaths would be in the care home sector, would they not?
I would believe so, yes.
Yes. So let me put the question again. In terms of the balance between the possible outcomes of an unprepared no-deal EU exit and the appalling loss of life attendant upon a pandemic, why did no one say we cannot afford to stop the pandemic preparedness?
I think in response to your question, there's a couple of points I think are important to make. The first one is that the adult social care sector had done some work in pandemic preparedness prior to the pause of the work. Secondly, I think the work that was done for Operation Yellowhammer was of benefit to our preparedness for a In considering where to allocate resources, what I consider is what is a real and present and credible threat are allocated. I retained teamwork on the real risk of a disruption through a no-deal exit.
All right. Maybe then look briefly at the NSRA process to which you've referred. In 2019.
The National Risk Register's reassessment comes to my team to lead the process for reviewing whether the risk is still the same risk. One of my team led the work on developing that risk assessment. I was aware of the work at the time that was led within my team.
Not all the risks, indeed only a very small number of the risks, fall within the reach of the Department of Health and Social Care. Of course, disease is one of them, perhaps the main one.
The department has a number of risks on the risk register. Not all of the department's risks fall within the confines of my directorate's work. We deal with emerging infectious disease risk and we deal with pandemic risks, but there are risks that sit outside my team in the other parts of the department.
Do you accept, as Ms Hammond, on behalf of the Cabinet Office, and of course the Cabinet Office and the DHSE co-chair the Pandemic Flu Readiness Board, do you accept the evidence, would you accept in relation to the DHSE, as Ms Hammond accepted in relation to the Cabinet Office, that the DHSE would have been better prepared for a pandemic if had the reasonable worst case scenario been closer, a lot closer to the realities of COVID than it was?
Yes, I think it stands to reason that we would have built the different set of responses and plans had the risk that we were dealing with been a COVID risk.
There is evidence before my lady that Dame Deirdre Hine, in her review of the swine flu pandemic in 2009, had expressed some concerns about the adequacy of the RWCS, the reasonable worst case scenario model. Within the DHSE, as far as you're aware, were concerns ever expressed about the adequacy of the RWCS model, and in particular the risk that by focusing on the assumed worst-case scenario, it could lead to a tendency to stop thinking about how to prevent that worst-case scenario from actually happening?
In the way in which you ask, nobody had raised with me a concern about the process for developing the reasonable worst case, or that risk that we don't do work on the lead up to that risk occurring. And I believe that with the emerging infectious disease risk, we had complementary capabilities in two different sets of scenarios, which would have addressed where those risks would have taken us.
But of course, as you now accept, the scenario for new infectious disease was predicated on a very limited outbreak with relatively very limited consequences.
Indeed, and the mitigations that we had in place for managing that had been adequate for the outbreaks of those emerging infectious diseases I experienced over the 5 years of my appointment.
Putting it another way, because the reasonable worst case scenario for a non-influenza outbreak was described in such very limited terms, confined to health settings, relatively small number of casualties, an even smaller number, tragic though they are, of deaths, much less was required of the department to mitigate for that risk, because the risk, of course, had none of the terrible catastrophic consequences that the COVID pandemic resulted in.
Sorry,
Yes, you didn't have to do very much by way of mitigating the new and emerging infectious disease risk, because the risk was described in a very limited way. It didn't have the catastrophic or national consequences that a severe influenza pandemic would have, or as COVID had.
I wouldn't agree with the statement that there was less for us to be concerned with relation to a high consequence infectious disease risk. They are extremely serious, and we work very closely with NHS England and Public Health England to ensure the plans were in place for managing that risk.
I didn't suggest that you were less concerned. I said what you had to do practically by way of mitigating the risk was a great deal less than what you had to have done had you been mitigating for a severe national pandemic.
I think it's true to say that our work on pandemic influenza was a greater responsibility for the department, yes.
And that work was framed by that 2011 strategy, which said in terms, you don't need to worry about things like borders or quarantining or self-isolation or mass test and trace, because none of it was envisaged, was it?
I would say that, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was framed by that. It was the work that we did on pandemic influenza was framed by a series of documents, by exercise sickness, by the risk registers across that period of time. So it was a number of different documents, including the 2011 strategy.
When Mr. Hancock MP became Secretary of State for your department in July 2018, that was after you had been appointed to your post as Director of the EPHP Directorate. He was provided with a document 181825, please. I've got the wrong reference. That's his witness statement. Could we have 184105 then instead, please? Introduction to Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response. So this was a paper which was prepared for him. I think at his request, he wanted some more information about England's emergency preparedness, resilience and response. Could we go down, please, to paragraph 12? Following a national level exercise in 2016 and a subsequent National Security Council Threats, Hazards, Resilience and Contingencies meeting in February 17, a cross-government pandemic flu readiness board was established to develop and manage the UK's preparedness for a flu pandemic. The first year of the programme included the following work streams, and then over the page, please. Response to the adult social care and community health system, coping with excess deaths, legal, moral and ethical considerations that led to the MEAG committee being set up, keeping different sectors working with reduced staff numbers. If that could be shrunk, please. And then at paragraph 13, reference to mass casualty planning. Do you recall assisting in the process by which Mr. Hancock was briefed in relation to the general state of preparedness?
I am not familiar and cannot recall specifically adding to this briefing. I can say and can recall that when new ministers arrive, I do support Clara Swinson in producing an assessment of the very current situation of risks and threats that the department faces as part of new ministerial briefing, but I can't specifically recall contributing to this particular one.
Paragraph 12, the first few words are, following a national level exercise in 2016. Would that have been a reference to exercise Cygnus, do you think?
Looking at the reference to the Pandemic Flu Readiness Board, I would assume it was in relation to exercise Cygnus and not exercise Alice.
Yes, because it was a direct result of exercise Cygnus that the then Prime Minister directed in the NSC THRC meeting that a board be set up and a programme of work devised for the Pandemic Flu Readiness Board.
That's correct.
Looking back, are you surprised that there is no reference in this paragraph to the conclusions of exercise Cygnus, which you described earlier yourself as being concerning, to the effect that the UK's preparedness and response in terms of its plans, policies and capability were not sufficient?
No, I wouldn't say that I was surprised that it didn't go into more detail in this note. From my brief reading of this note, my assessment is that this was a very early briefing given to our Secretary of State to set out the range of threats and hazards that the department faced. In 2018, there had been a series of challenging incidents. Over the last 5 years of my role, 32 major incidents, not including anything relating to COVID. So it's very important at the very start of a Secretary of State's tenure that they're clear about our risk assessment and their Category 1 responder requirements. I would have expected reference to the high-level risks on pandemic influenza and emerging disease, but in the context of the wider threat landscape.
What was the highest risk in the entirety of the government's risk assessment procedures?
When it came to hazards, it was pandemic influenza.
And what was the lead government department for in pandemic influenza?
The Department of Health and Social Care.
So are you not therefore somewhat surprised that there was no reference to the fact that the greatest hazard risk in the entirety of the government's book of risks was a pandemic influenza, and that the national level exercise of exercise Cygnus, which dealt with the possibility of an influenza pandemic, had reached the conclusions that it did in such serious terms?
I would not have expected that document at that time to have included more information on that risk than it did. It is also useful to recognise that there had been poisoning in Salisbury, there had been breast cancer screening incidents, so it was in the context of a number of different incidents that had occurred. I would expect the risk register to have been referred to as it was in this document.
Maybe then discuss in a little more detail some of the exercises. You were concerned because you were one of the two deputy directors within the department leading on the response to the Ebola outbreak. So you were concerned very much with how the department did respond.
Yes.
To what extent, and I should say that, was that outbreak 2014, 15, so not when you were director of the EPHP, you weren't appointed to that post until February 18, it was whilst you were in a different post?
That's correct.
All right. To what extent were you concerned with taking on the recommendations in the report on the Ebola outbreak once the outbreak was over?
Are you talking about at the immediate time or in my current post?
No, at the immediate time. So following the outbreak, obviously there was a certain amount of learning and reports were produced dealing with the outbreak and what could be learned from them and making recommendations as to the future. To what extent were you concerned with that process?
I was involved in the lessons learned processes. There were a number of different lessons learned processes post the Ebola outbreak, and I moved to different roles that were unconnected in this area in the intervening period. So the work was continued by my colleagues.
So you were involved in the lessons learned processes, but only for a while?
Some of the lessons learned processes. There was a number of lessons learned processes.
Right. Roles. To what extent were you concerned? For how long were you involved in the lessons learning process?
I'm recalling that some of the lessons learned processes were operational lessons learned, and some of them were more detailed lessons learned series of sessions. I was not involved in the more formal lessons learned processes, if I can recall.
The reason I ask, Miss Reid, is that, as you will no doubt recall, one of the lessons, lesson 8 from the Ebola report, was that appropriate levels of PPE should be maintained for ongoing infectious disease preparedness. And a second lesson, lesson 16, was that consideration needed to be given to the development of the relevant powers to allow stepped interventions from port through to community. So, in a sense, social restrictions or closing of borders or management of people and gatherings. Can you recall what steps were taken to pursue those issues, to draw up further papers or develop the thinking on PPE and social interventions?
So thinking about the PPE aspect of your question, PPE and appropriate levels of PPE were part of the mitigations that were recommended on the back of the emerging infectious disease risk. Ebola is an emerging infectious disease. It's a high consequence infectious disease and would therefore have been dealt with under the mitigations for that particular risk.
Can I just pause you there? Is that a reference back to what you said earlier, which is that of the two risks, health or disease-related risks in the risk assessment process, you've got influenza pandemic with its assumed catastrophic consequences, and then you've got the much narrower new and emerging infectious disease risk with the assumed much narrower consequences, and therefore reference to PPE would be a reference to the PPE required in a health setting or in a much narrower way.
That is correct. Ebola would have been classed as an emerging infectious disease and would have been treated as an emerging disease with the mitigations that would be appropriate for the management of high consequence infectious disease. And with that, your question around PPE is the PPE advice that would be given to us would be based on how you have that intensive treatment regime for a high consequence infectious disease and what would be the appropriate PPE required to manage those diseases.
What about lesson 16 and the consideration of powers that might be required to adopt interventions in the community? So restrictions on movement or public gatherings or border controls and so on. Do you recall what work was done on those issues?
I don't recall the work that was done on those issues. I am aware that there was a view that border restrictions wouldn't be the appropriate response for an emerging infectious disease or pandemic influenza.
Of course, that's why it was the lesson in the report. But was this not something that, at least subsequently, as the director of the directorate, you would have seen the outcome of the work done to put that recommendation into place?
I'm aware of work that Public Health England and latterly UK Health Security Agency have been doing around border measures. I'm not aware of any work that was done to restrict border access.
Exercise Alice was in 2016, wasn't it? And it was an assumed large-scale outbreak of MERS coronavirus.
Yes.
That's correct. Was that an exercise in which the Department of Health and Social Care was a participant, an organiser, or just an observer?
The exercise was run by Public Health England and the Department of Health and Social Care participated in that. I wasn't in post at the time.
But there were a number of recommendations made as a result of the report following on that exercise, were there not?
That's correct.
And those recommendations included issues such as developing plans for, or at least considering the need for quarantine, self-isolation, the collection of data from contacts, an enlarged process of community sampling. Of course, again, this was regarded as a high consequence infectious disease. What happened with those lessons and the putting into place of practical measures to give effect to them?
Yes, there were two bodies of work that were set up to lead pieces of work on how to respond to those actions. One was developed by NHS England. They set up a high consequence infectious diseases programme. The Department of Health was a participant to that piece of work. And Public Health England set up a programme of work to also respond to the recommendations and the work on high consequence infectious disease. As I understand it, NHS England's board continues and we still play an active role on that, and PHE's commitments have been embedded within their programme of work at UK HSA.
Both those work streams, Ms. Reid, were clinically related, weren't they? They were to do with how the NHS clinically would deal with the impact of a high consequence infectious disease outbreak and how Public Health England would deal, well, I suppose, semi-clinically with the outcome of an outbreak. Where was the work done by the DHSC by way of plans for quarantine, self-isolation, enhanced community sampling and collection of data?
I would say that the recommendations were both clinical and operational, and that the clinical and operational elements of them were led by NHS England and Public Health England, with bodies that we were on to support. In your answer to your question about where the work on contact tracing was led, that was within Public Health England.
Did the DHSC, as far as you are aware, take forward, produce papers or policies or guidance or spend time thinking about
So the advice on clinical and operational matters would be the responsibility of NHS with advice. I am not a clinician and I'm not well placed. The health and social care organisations that can. We were very aware of the level of readiness in the health and social care system to deal with an emerging infectious disease. There were, off memory, approximately 8 or 9 in the 5 years of my appointment. And so I was very had run a number of incidents to see how that operated in practice.
Those recommendations were not lessons. X, Y, or Z must be done. Way within the limits of their own functions to these areas of concern. While doing what it could to improve the overall system of preparedness for health emergency by addressing these particular issues.
I would say that it is within the remit of those organisations to lead the response that was required to those recommendations, and that is set in the remit letters and the responsibilities that those organisations hold to deliver adequate preparedness to an outbreak of aligned within the responsibility of those two bodies to do.
Exercise Cygnus was that the UK's plans, policies and capability were not sufficient to cope with the extreme demands of a severe pandemic. How often, as far as you're aware, was that conclusion considered within your department once you took up post 18 months later?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
How often was active consideration given to whether or not that general conclusion from Exercise Cygnus was being dealt with? How often were meetings held where employees in the department would say, right, well, that was the serious conclusion from the exercise. How well are we doing in terms of addressing those concerns, of making sure that the plans and the policies and capability are now sufficient? How often was active consideration given to making sure that that worrying feature was being adequately addressed?
I would say on a regular number of occasions in different ways. That the concern that was raised in Cygnus was a feature of our risk and our risk register. That was discussed every level of the department on a quarterly basis. We had boards that were looking at the readiness of the health and social care system to respond to that. That was chaired by my Director General, Clara Swinson. We had quarterly conversations to look at cross-government readiness and whether we were addressing the recommendations of that report. So, and also regular meetings with our Permanent Secretary. So I think the question about how we were responding to our state of readiness was asked on a regular occasion.
How many recommendations came out of Exercise Cygnus?
22, and 4 learning recommendations.
By June 2020, how many of those recommendations did the DHSC itself identify had not been fully completed?
Off my recollection, I would say that 8 of them had not been fully completed, or had been partially completed, and about 6 of them had not been completed at all.
That was, you're quite right, the conclusion of a DHSC meeting, another work stream, to consider to what degree the department, or to what degree the recommendations from Exercise Cygnus had not been completed. And that was a conclusion reached in June 2020, was it not, Ms. Reid?
That sounds about the right date, yes.
All right, take it from me then.
Can I just ask what you mean by not fully completed, not completed at all? Completed means done, completed. And so I would have thought not fully completed means work had started but it hadn't finished. Not completed at all, I don't understand.
Okay, allow me to expand. Some of the recommendations had different component parts to them. And so there may be an element of a part that had been completed. So, for example, we had completed some work on surge guidance. That had been completed, but the second half of that around socialising that with or testing that with health and social care organisations, that part of it was not completed.
But that would come under the category of not fully completed.
I think that's a fair conclusion to reach. Yes.
So what do we mean by 6 were not completed at all? Do we mean no work had started?
No, I wouldn't say that no work had started. Work had started on all of the recommendations, but there were some elements of those that had been completed. So I would agree with your conclusion that they weren't completed, but work had begun on all of them.
Or they hadn't got very far?
It varies across the recommendations, my lady.
If you have a recommendation that says we must get more PPE, this is a highly infectious disease, it's got dreadful consequences, we must get... Whose responsibility is it to get the PPE?
I would suggest that would be my responsibility.
And who would ensure that your responsibility was carried out, apart from you?
That would be the responsibility of my permanent secretary and the departmental board.
So after Ebola, you had a recommendation for more PPE, was it?
I can't recall the recommendation from Ebola, my lady.
I think there was one in relation to PPE.
If there was a recommendation that related to PPE being acquired for an emerging infectious disease, as I understand it, the PPE stockpiles for emerging infectious disease have been adequately built. I haven't had anything to tell me to the contrary. So I can't, unfortunately before my time, I can't confirm whether or not and how the recommendations for Ebola's PPE were delivered, but I can say that hasn't been raised to me as an issue, that there isn't adequate PPE for an emerging infectious disease.
Thank you.
Can I assist you, Miss Reid? Lesson 8 from Ebola is that further work would be required between the Department of Health, NHS England and Public Health England to determine the most appropriate levels of PPE that should be maintained for ongoing infectious disease preparedness. But for the reasons that we have been debating, namely that the assumed consequences of infectious non-influenza disease were set so low, were so narrow, in terms of being confined to healthcare settings and very low levels of casualties and fatalities. Not very much PPE was required to meet what was thought to be necessary for a high consequence infectious disease, but no consideration was given at all to the need for PPE for a non-influenza pandemic. That's the sum of it, isn't it?
The risk assessment we were building our mitigations for were a pandemic influenza and emerging infectious disease, and in both of those cases, with advice from experts and specialists, we were advised what PPE we needed for both of those risks. If you start from the premise of the risk you're mitigating, you build the appropriate mitigation for those risks. So it is the case that we had appropriate PPE for those two scenarios, but not for a COVID pandemic, which was not the risk we were managing.
And going back to the recommendations, the recommendations from Cygnus, 14 of which had not been fully completed, whatever that means, 8 partially, perhaps 6 not fully completed. That was not a situation in June 2020 which took anybody by surprise, was it?
No. The recommendations that hadn't been completed were part of our ongoing programme of work. And as I mentioned earlier, some elements of our programme needed to be paused. And so there were elements of those programmes that hadn't been completed. I would also say that there are a number of recommendations in Cygnus that it's not really conceivable for us to say that we have ever fully completed. So the first recommendation is that our emergency preparedness must follow best practice. Well, by definition, we never complete that because the process is about continuous learning. So I'd never feel comfortable being at the point of saying that we've absolutely completed that activity. The way that some of the recommendations were phrased was such that they were about ongoing work and continuous development. So I think it would be difficult for us to ever get to the point that we'd say all 22 of those had been completed.
The point, Ms. Reid, though, is this, isn't it? As at June 2020, the body that was looking at how many of the recommendations were implemented couldn't have been taken by surprise. It must have been apparent to everybody who was responsible for implementing the implementations from 2016 through to 2020 that the recommendations were not being implemented. It just was not being done for a variety of reasons, which you've attempted to explain. It just wasn't done.
There were a number of recommendations that weren't completed. That's absolutely correct.
And you knew that the recommendations were not being implemented. 2016 was 4 years before this committee reported as to the number which weren't being implemented.
That's correct.
And if we could have, please, on the screen, 22792. Which is the report into exercise Cygnus. Page 6. At 1. Amongst the recommendations which were never implemented in full were this one. Correct?
That's correct.
Page 8. At 3. Work to be done on how the public would respond to a pandemic. That is to say, whether it would self-isolate, whether it would cope with the demands of mandatory quarantining, how it would respond to social restrictions. Correct?
I can't say with certainty whether any of the work was done on this particular recommendation. I don't think it is concluded.
No, the only thing that was done, Ms. Reid, wasn't it, was that a committee was set up called MEAG, of which my lady has heard, the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group, which would give advice in the event of a pandemic on some of the moral and ethical questions that might arise.
Yes.
But the work done, the behavioural work done as to how the public would deal with social restrictions and non-pharmaceutical interventions, and how in practice the country would be enabled to deal with the consequences of a catastrophic pandemic, were not addressed at all, were they?
No.
Page 9. An effective response to pandemic influenza requires the capability and capacity to surge resources into key areas which in some areas is currently lacking. The NHS did put into place, at your department's urging, plans for surge capacity. And we saw that, of course, when the pandemic struck. But very little work was done in relation to how the adult social care sector would cope with a mass influx of patients in a pandemic.
I wouldn't agree that there was no work done in that space. There was a lot of engagement with LRFs, and some guidance was issued to adult social care providers in May of 2018 that addressed the question of surge. I would not say that that work was completed, and I would be very clear to say that there was more that we needed to do about community surge, but it was not the case that no work was done.
Page 11. There was some feedback in the course of exercise Cygnus from local resilience forums to the effect that there are just too many plans, and there's a question about how up to date all the plans are and whether there are contradictions between them. What was done in order to rewrite the plans to produce something perhaps in a single document, something that was coherent and clear to the LRFs. Was that ever done?
No, it wasn't completed.
Page 12. Some of the feedback was to the effect that LRFs, the local resilience forums, would have difficulty operating their plans and capabilities at this scale of response. More focus and coordination on plan division operations centre itself. Now, of course, you don't speak for the Resilience and Emergencies Division of the Department of Levelling, but was that focus and coordination carried out?
I am aware that the Ministry for Housing engaged extensively with Local Resilience Forum. I'm aware the Cabinet Office engaged extensively with Local Resilience Forums on their resilience standard and their level of preparedness. Public Health England are represented on the Local Resilience Forum, so I also engaged with the health system that sits on Local Resilience. Recommendations that we didn't deliver, which I regret, around that coordination and the bringing together of advice.
Ladies, is that a convenient moment?
Certainly. I shall return at 12 o'clock.